September 19th, 2000. In the quiet farming village of Guozhuang in the Hunan province of China, an elderly couple settles in for the night. 70-year-old Yang Peimin and his wife, Shan Lanying, share a modest home like countless others in rural China. Outside, the fields lie still, the village silent. Nothing to hint at the horror about to unfold. In the dead of night, a shadow slips into their home. He carries no gun, no knife, only a brick he picked up outside. The couple never has a chance to fight back. Blow after blow crashes down on their heads, the brick caving in their skulls. Within minutes, both lie motionless, their lives extinguished in the most brutal of ways. The killer doesn't linger. He searches through drawers and cupboards, grabbing what little money he can, before disappearing into the night. By morning, the peace of Guozhuang is shattered. Neighbours gather in disbelief, struggling to understand how such violence could reach their quiet community. Initially, suspicions turn inwards, with neighbours pointing the finger at a local man called Yang Deli, who'd quarrelled with the couple over cigarette money. Everyone in the village knew about the dispute, so the police believe they found their motive. So they arrest Deli, who eventually confesses to the crime. And for a while, it seems like the case has been solved. But Deli wasn't guilty. His false confession had been coerced under torture, and the case against him would eventually be dropped, though not before destroying his life. While police focused on the wrong man, the real murderer was able to slip away unnoticed, just as he would again and again in the years to come. Because this was no ordinary crime. It wasn't the work of a neighbour, or a thief, or a man driven by a moment of madness. It was something else, something far worse. The true killer was a drifter called Yang Xinhai, a predator who moved silently across the countryside, moving from province to province like a phantom. Wherever he stopped, the story was the same. Doors broken open, families butchered in their sleep, entire households wiped from existence in a single night. By the time he was finally stopped, at least 67 people had already died by his hands, including men, women, and even children. This is the story of Yang Xinhai, the most prolific serial killer in the history of the People's Republic of China. Or as the public and the press came to know him, the monster killer. Yang Xinhai was born on July 17, 1968, in Zhengyang County in the Hunan province, in a small farming village of roughly 1,000 households. Most families there were poor, but the Yangs were among the poorest. His parents, Zhongguan and Xiaoyun, barely scraped by, raising 6 children in a 2-room mud brick house. Food was scarce, and money was even scarcer. They were so poor that they had next to no furniture, and only turned on the lights when they had visitors. Clothes were worn until they fell apart. Nothing was wasted. Xinhai was their 3rd child and his mother's favourite. He was quiet, polite, and respectful. He was well liked in the village, and from an early age he showed signs of being intelligent and talented, so much so that he was skipped straight into 2nd grade when he attended elementary school. He was particularly good at drawing. His paintings were famous around the village, which gave his father an immense sense of pride in his son. Zhongguan regularly boasted about Xinhai's talents, and it really seemed to everyone that he was destined for something more than the life he was born into. That idea seemed to be proven true when he became the only one of his siblings, and even on his entire street, to make it into high school. But the school was more than 10 miles away from his home, meaning he had to board there. His poverty became a constant point of humiliation for him. All of his clothes were tattered hand-me-downs from his older brothers, and his family couldn't afford to support him or to even feed him properly. They'd had to borrow money just to pay his initial expenses to get into the school. They had nothing left to give him. While his classmates traded meal tickets for hot food, Xinhai's father dropped off small bags of grain once a month for him to cook. But it was never enough, so he was forced to scavenge for wild greens and the occasional potato to fill his stomach. His parents couldn't afford to keep up with his school fees, so instead several of his teachers quietly covered them, seeing his potential and wanting to help support him. But the shame of his situation ate at him. He grew isolated and withdrawn, and he began to resent all of his classmates, growing angry at the unfairness of the cards life had seemingly handed him. And it wasn't long before his grades began to collapse. He spent much of his time filling cheap exercise books with stories and scraps of invented worlds, places he called things like Plato Heights. And his writing was far darker than anyone had realized at the time. Murder, mutilation, mayhem. In the spring of 1985, the humiliation became too much for him, and he dropped out of school. He had asked his father for more food, but when he arrived with it, he discovered Xinhai hadn't been seen for weeks. At 17 years old, he'd abandoned everything and just walked away from his life. Instead of returning home to his village, Xinhai drifted across China. He worked menial jobs to support himself, taking whatever he could find. Coal mines, construction sites, restaurants. But his employers often underpaid him, sometimes refusing to pay him at all. He rarely stayed in one place for long. As the years went by, he cut ties with his family, barely contacting them at all as he slipped from one province to the next, travelling by foot or by bicycle. All the while, his anger, resentment, and bitterness towards the whole world continued to fester. He later claimed he was treated with contempt everywhere he went, and nobody ever showed him any respect. Finally, after working shifts in a restaurant and receiving no pay, he snapped. He stole items from the kitchen and sold them, determined to get what he was owed. But that moment changed everything for him. He realized that crime, that stealing, paid faster, paid more, and was far easier than all the hard labor he'd been doing. And not only that, it gave him a way to get back at the world that he believed had wronged him. So he stopped working dead-end jobs and made theft his new way of life. But by 1988, the law caught up with him. He was arrested for pickpocketing in Xi'an and sentenced to 2 years at a labor camp for what authorities called re-education. Upon his release, he immediately started stealing again, though he actually met a woman who he claimed he fell in love with and planned to marry. But any semblance of hope or normality that relationship gave him was short-lived, because in 1991, less than a year after his release, he was caught stealing again and sent back to the labor camp. His girlfriend promised that she'd wait for him, but when he returned from prison, he discovered that she'd already married someone else. That betrayal cut him deeply. Whatever minuscule sympathy he had left for the world around him was completely shattered. He felt humiliated and disrespected all over again. And it wasn't long before his crimes began to escalate. He could no longer contain all the rage and hatred that had been building up inside of him. And by 1996, he finally let it all out and attacked a woman in Zhejiang in Hunan, attempting to sexually assault her. But the woman fought back, with such ferocity that she bit off a piece of his tongue, and managed to escape. Xinhai was quickly tracked down by the police and convicted of the assault, leading to a 5-year sentence in prison. As a sex offender, he was targeted by other inmates, which only made his feelings of resentment, hatred, and anger towards everyone in the world even stronger. When he left prison after serving 4 of his 5 years, he was scarred, and he was more volatile, more hate-filled, and more dangerous than ever. He no longer felt like he was part of society. So with nothing left to lose, he abandoned steady work and returned to burglary, breaking into homes and taking what he needed. And then on September 19, 2000, he broke into an elderly couple's house in Guozhuang and brutally bludgeoned them both to death with a brick. He felt no guilt for what he'd done, no remorse. Instead, he felt a rush like nothing he'd ever experienced before. And along with it came a new, overwhelming desire to do it again, and again, and again. Just weeks after he committed his first murders, Xinhai struck again. On October 1st, 2000, he travelled hundreds of miles from Hunan to Anhui province and broke into the home of 63-year-old Qi Junying. Her 2 grandchildren, 7-year-old Zhang Yatao and 12-year-old Zhang Yateng, were staying with her that night. But that didn't deter Xinhai. When the bodies were discovered, the scene was horrific. A hole had been smashed into Junying's forehead with an iron rod. She had been so badly beaten that her jaw was split open, exposing her teeth. Yatao had been strangled with rope and stabbed in the neck as he lay in his bed. And Yateng was found naked with a hole smashed into her skull and signs that she had been sexually assaulted, most likely after she was already dead. Police would later claim Xinhai had spotted Yateng during the day and targeted the house to attack her, and that Junying had been killed when she tried to stop him and intervene. But at the time, he wasn't even on anyone's radar. He was a drifter with no fixed address. The police didn't even know he existed. And instead, suspicion fell, once again, on a local villager with a grudge against the family. The villager, Chu Jiku, was detained and interrogated for days, even beaten by the police, who hoped to force a confession out of him. In the end, with no evidence against him, he confessed to a number of thefts instead. He was then charged with possession of an illegal firearm after an old hunting rifle was found in his home, and he was sentenced to a year of re-education through labour. Despite the lack of proof, villagers whispered that Jiku was the monster who had killed Junying and her grandchildren. His entire family was shunned. It would take years and DNA evidence for police to finally clear him. By then, the damage to his life and his family's reputation was already done. Both attacks followed the same pattern: an intruder sneaking into a home in the dead of night and killing everyone inside by beating in their skulls until they'd been crushed. But at the time, no connection between the two attacks was made. They had taken place in different provinces, hundreds of miles apart. And as far as the police were concerned, both were the acts of local men who had existing conflicts with the victims. Within less than 2 weeks, Xinhai had murdered 5 people, including 2 children. But then, for almost a year, there was silence. There were no new attacks, no new bodies discovered. But any hope that he regretted what he'd done and was going to stop would have been misplaced. Because really, Xinhai was just biding his time, surviving off petty theft, refining his methods, and keeping himself invisible as he drifted from province to province. And when he resurfaced in 2001, his violence would escalate to new levels of cruelty. Yang Xinhai didn't kill on impulse. He watched his victims, sometimes for days or weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment arrived on the night of August 15, 2001. In a small farmhouse in a village in Linying County, 42-year-old Chu Yongxian was asleep alongside her 14-year-old daughter, Liu Feifei, and her 11-year-old son, Liu Jitong. At around midnight, Xinhai broke into the house. With an iron hammer, he smashed their skulls until gaping holes formed in their foreheads. Before he left, he assaulted Feifei's body and stole around 100 yuan in cash. The family were discovered by the children's grandmother. Her screams drew the village out to the farmhouse, and it wasn't long before police flooded the area, convinced the killer had to be someone nearby. Like with the previous attacks, police immediately assumed the killer would be a local who had a personal issue with the family. Though unlike those cases, there was no clear scapegoat to blame the murders on. So they questioned every man in the village, taking blood samples and fingerprints to compare to evidence collected from the house. But nothing matched, and it wasn't long before the case began to turn cold. After the attack, Xinhai drifted east across Hunan to Kanglu Township in Xihua County. One night in September, he forced his way into a modest home there and bludgeoned the 2 people inside, Bai Guiying and Geng Oigang, with another hammer. Then in December, he scaled a wall into a courtyard in Ye County near the town of Pingdingshan and slipped through a weathered wooden door into another home, killing Zhou Guo and Xinhua as they slept inside. He ransacked the house afterwards, and by dawn, he was already miles away on his bicycle. In a matter of months, 7 more people had been brutally killed, and every single murder was exactly the same. He found a rural, isolated home, broke in the dead of night, and massacred everyone inside as they slept. The victims were all bludgeoned to death with blunt objects that he found, such as hammers, axes, and shovels. And he attacked with such force that he caved in the foreheads of practically every single one of his victims. He left the weapons at the scene or discarded them afterwards. And this led local villagers who had seen the horror of his murders to begin whispering about a deranged monster they called the Hammer Man. He wore brand new clothes during each attack. Sometimes he pulled socks over his shoes to make sure he didn't leave any prints on the ground. Other times, he purposefully wore shoes that were too big for him. He always tossed everything away after each attack. The victims had no connection to one another, as Xinhai picked houses more or less at random. He would cycle around the country until he found a suitable target, and then instantly move on after the murders. He never lingered in the area, and was rarely ever even seen entering or leaving a village. He was essentially a ghost. The result was confusion for the authorities. Next to nothing was stolen from the crime scenes, and there seemed to be no motive for the vicious attacks, aside from the act of killing itself. But with the attacks scattered across different jurisdictions, handled by different police departments, nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized they were dealing with a single monstrous killer. At least, not yet. And because of the way crime is reported in China, there were no news stories about the attacks. Nothing for the villagers to see and realize there was a pattern. As we saw in the red dress killer case, crimes are normally only reported by Chinese news stations after the case has been solved and an arrest has been made. And sadly, this meant nobody, not the police, not the public, was even aware of Xinhai. And nobody was able to stop him from continuing his rampage into 2002, which was about to become his bloodiest year yet. By the start of 2002, nobody realized they were dealing with a single killer. Yang Xinhai had already wiped out entire households, yet he remained invisible. And with no one even aware he existed, he was about to escalate his crimes beyond anything China had ever seen. On January 6th, in Xinhai County in Hunan, Xinhai slipped into a family home under the cover of darkness. By morning, 5 people were dead. Among them was a mother whose body he violated after death. Less than 3 weeks later, on January 27th, he struck again in Tongsu County. 3 more people were killed, and once again, a young mother, just 32 years old, was sexually assaulted post-mortem. In June and July, 2 more families were annihilated, 4 people in Joku and another 4 in Nanyang, including several children as young as 12. Each scene was the same: skulls caved in by his iron hammer, deep holes punched into foreheads, bodies broken beyond recognition, men, women, children, slaughtered. Almost every woman and girl, regardless of age, was assaulted, usually after death. By autumn, Xinhai was no longer waiting months between his attacks. He was moving constantly, drifting from one village to the next, and wherever he stopped, households were wiped from existence. On October 22nd, in Jiahu village in Xiping County, a farmer called Fang Chunhe and his 6-year-old daughter, Fang Junli, were killed in their sleep. His wife Wu Qinghua was also attacked. She was pregnant at the time, and although she survived, she suffered catastrophic head injuries and lost her baby. As you might expect by now, the investigating police initially insisted the murderer had to be someone who lived nearby in the surrounding villages. They launched door-to-door sweeps and even took palm prints and fingerprints from thousands of men within a 5-kilometer radius, but none of that brought them any closer to stopping Xinhai. Part of the reason detectives seemed to always assume it was a local man who had committed the murders was because of the unusual locations the crimes took place in. Xinhai always targeted remote villages, with poor access. There was no trace of anyone arriving or leaving, because he either walked or cycled vast distances and remained hidden in the shadows until he attacked. As a result, it was typically assumed someone from nearby was responsible for the crimes. Just 2 weeks later, on November 8th, he struck again. This time in Gaoli village in Shanghai County. 4 members of the Sun family were slaughtered, with a 5th victim surviving with devastating injuries. Every woman he encountered that night was assaulted. 8 days after that, he had moved into Weishi County. In Liuzhuang village, 65-year-old Zhang Guihua and her 14-year-old granddaughter, Liu Huang, were both bludgeoned to death, with Huang being found to have been assaulted after death. And then only 3 days later, on November 19th, Zhang Kanzhong and Jia Tini were killed in their beds in Shiguai village in Linying County, their skulls smashed in until their foreheads collapsed inward. In 4 weeks, Xinhai had claimed more than 10 lives across 3 different prefectures. Every crime scene was practically identical, and with such relentless frequency, the authorities finally began to connect the dots and realized that these were not isolated incidents involving neighborhood disputes. The detectives from Xiping, Linying, and Shanghai began comparing notes on these new cases and almost immediately realized that they were the work of a single serial killer. So the Henan Provincial Public Security Bureau convened a meeting and formed a new task force. They called it the 815 Series Murder Investigation, named after the earlier massacre in Linying the previous year. The profile they built was narrow. They believed the killer was a drifter, a man aged between 25 and 40 from a poor background, with a history of burglary, robbery, or sexual assault. But the forensic picture was thin. Xinhai had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. Alongside wearing socks over his shoes, and shoes that were too big, he wore gloves to avoid leaving prints. He discarded his weapons after each attack, with various hammers being found at crime scenes. He even ejaculated into cloths to avoid leaving viable semen samples. Most of the time, only trace evidence remained. The odd hair, a smear of blood, a partial footprint. It wasn't much, but now that the detectives had finally begun to compare files, they realized these fragments all belonged to the same man. They just needed a match. So they pulled fingerprint cards from more than 30,000 ex-prisoners, and they collected blood samples from recently released labor camp inmates, and when those men couldn't be found, from their parents. But nothing matched the traces from the scenes. Somehow, even though Xinhai fit the profile perfectly, he wasn't identified at this stage. And because of that, he remained free to keep on killing. Even though the police had now connected the cases, Xinhai's pace did not relent. On December 1st, in Yanwan village in Luyi County, he forced his way into a farmhouse at night. By dawn, Sun Qinglian and Zhang Guilian were dead. Their daughter survived the attack, but was left with critical injuries. Just 5 days later came one of the darkest nights of his spree. In Luizhuang village in Saiping County, the Liu family were preparing to move into their new home. But before they had the chance, Xinhai slipped into their home while they slept, and armed with a hammer, he killed Liu Jianwei, his wife, their young son and daughter, and Jianwei's mother. The only member of the Liu family who survived that night was 68-year-old Liu Zhongyuan, Jianwei's father. He had been staying in the unfinished house, which the family planned to move into on December 9th. When Zhongyuan returned at first light, he walked into a scene of carnage. He later described finding his granddaughter lying on the floor with a hole smashed into her forehead, before stumbling across his grandson, his son, and his daughter-in-law all in similar states. His wife, however, was still alive when he found her. He said she was blinking faintly but unable to speak. She passed away 10 days later in hospital. Xinhai later admitted that after the massacre, he buried the hammer in a cemetery before he dumped his blood-stained clothes in a river and walked 2 hours on foot to Luohe. Somehow, despite the extreme nature of his violence, Xinhai always remained calm, collected, and methodical in covering his tracks. A week later, on December 13th, he killed again. In Sijia village in Yanling County, Sida Sheng, his wife Yueyang, and their son Xixiang were all murdered in their home. And then just 2 days after that, on December 15th, Xinhai crossed into Anhui province, and in Shaolizhuang in Linquan County, he murdered Li Xinde and his 2 children. His 13-year-old daughter was sexually assaulted after death. His 9-year-old son was found with mud caked on one of his hands, believed to be from trying to escape into the garden before being dragged back. Their grandmother, Han Fangying, was the one who forced open the door after 2 days of silence. Inside, she discovered all 3 of them lying in their beds, with their skulls shattered. By the end of 2002, Xinhai had killed more than 30 people, and he still wasn't finished, because 2003 would bring new murders and a new level of panic, and finally, an end to his violence. By the turn of 2003, the task force had a profile, but not a name. Fear in rural villages was intense. Communities organised night patrols, keeping watch over households. Even if the press wasn't allowed to cover the case, it was an open secret that a ruthless serial killer was attacking rural households and butchering families. A monster killer. The police even began handing out leaflets containing details of their profile in various villages. But they didn't stick them on walls or publish the information in the news out of fear of both spooking their killer and spooking the wider Chinese public. They even offered substantial rewards for help identifying their phantom. According to the police, public tips flooded in. Sometimes they received more than 100 reports in a single month at just one single township station. But despite all of this, Xinhai continued killing. On February 5th, in Kuzhuang Township in Jiangcheng County, he slipped through a door after midnight, and by morning, 3 more people were dead. Once again, they'd all had their foreheads smashed in, and a woman had been sexually assaulted. A 4th victim was left barely alive. 13 days later, on February 18th, 4 more people were killed in an attack in Qiying Township in Xinhai County, with 2 women having been assaulted. However, this attack occurred close to a township seat rather than in a remote village, which caused the investigators to worry that their killer was about to change up his tactics and make it even more difficult to identify him or predict his next move. Then on March 23rd, he claimed another 4 lives and sexually assaulted another woman in Chengguan Town in Minquan County. And again, it was not an isolated rural location like they'd seen in the past. By now, the attacks almost felt procedural to the investigators. A neighbour or relative would walk into a house and find an entire family bludgeoned to death, with their foreheads smashed open by a hammer or similar weapon left at the scene. There'd only be trace evidence left behind: socked prints or different-sized shoe prints, partial smears of blood or partial fingerprints, No semen, despite women having been assaulted, almost always after death. Men, women, children, nobody spared, aside from the occasional victim who somehow survived their horrific bludgeoning. The 815 task force set up road checks, canvassed in nearby villages, and continued to issue quiet warnings to the increasingly panicked public. But Xinhai still wasn't deterred. He began sleeping rough in fields, avoiding roads entirely. He stole to eat, even being chased off once while stealing, by strangers who never realized they were scolding the deadliest serial killer in the country. Thankfully, according to his own account, as angry as it made him, he left without harming any of them. Then on April 2nd, he crossed into Shandong. In Sanlijai village, he scaled a wall and broke into the house of a newlywed couple. Li Yongning and Chen Mangyun had only been married for 100 days, and Mangyun was 3 months pregnant. Xinhai brutally murdered them both, caving in their skulls. But then there was silence. Through late spring and early summer, there were no new attacks. And then came August 5th. That night, in Lidao village in the Hebei province, he stole an axe from a neighbouring house and used it to kill Sun Shengjun, his wife Li Jishu, and their 15-year-old daughter, Sun Yuanyuan. He left the axe at the door as he left, tossing his gloves on the ground beside it. Just 3 days later, he killed again. In a village near the city of Shijiazhuang, he wiped out all 5 members of the Wei family, Wei Xianzeng, Fan Yuhua, and their 3 children, Yuji, Yuhui, and Yubind. In 26 separate attacks across 4 provinces, Xinhai had murdered at least 67 people, with several others left severely injured and many of the victims having been sexually assaulted. And by this point, the authorities were growing desperate. With police across all 4 provinces now sharing information, they generated a massive list of potential suspects. Because they were confident their killer was a drifter who'd already spent time in prison, they were sure he would be somewhere on someone's system. For the first time, Yang Xinhai appeared among their suspects. They were particularly interested in anyone with a criminal record who was often away from home. When Xinhai's village was canvassed, his father, Yang Zhongguan, admitted his son hadn't been back in years. That made him a clear match to the profile. So they took Zhongguan's blood to compare with their trace samples from the scenes. Zhongguan didn't have any idea what was going on at the time. He hadn't heard from his son in years, and he never could have imagined what the boy he once boasted about for his intelligence and artistic talent had become. But the forensic results were inconclusive. They couldn't confirm Xinhai as their killer, but they couldn't rule him out either. Meanwhile, Xinhai himself kept drifting north, slipping between checkpoints, hiding among Hebei's market towns. By this point, he was officially the deadliest serial killer in modern Chinese history. But in the end, it wouldn't be forensics or police work that caught him. It would be luck. Pure chance. Nothing more than Xinhai being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On November 3, 2003, police in the city of Kangzhou, in the Hebei province, were carrying out routine sweeps of local entertainment venues. They were looking for petty crime, gambling, theft, loiterers, that sort of stuff. Among the people they questioned was a thin, restless man with no identification on him. He had been sleeping in public baths and wandering the streets, and something just felt off about him to the officers. Some reports claim that he tried to flee from the officers, and when they caught up with him, they found a small knife in his pocket and around 500 yuan. Either way, the officers decided to arrest him and bring him in for questioning. They'd been told to look out for any drifters acting unusually, and this man unquestionably fit this profile. When asked his name, the man gave it without hesitation: Yang Xinhai. Confident, it seemed, that police had nothing to tie him to his crimes. What he didn't know was that his name was already on the suspect list circulated across the nation by the 815 task force. So in custody, samples of Xinhai's blood and hair were taken, alongside his fingerprints. And when they were compared to the fragments and trace evidence gathered from many of the 26 crime scenes, they were found to be a perfect match. The investigators had no doubt. The man sitting before them was the serial killer they had been chasing for years. The monster killer. But when confronted, Xinhai simply smirked and said, "If there's evidence, I'll admit it. If not, don't try to scare me." When the investigators revealed to him that they'd matched his samples to those found at several of the crime scenes, Xinhai still didn't admit to it though. Instead, he shrugged it off by saying, "DNA is science, right? 99% accurate. Maybe I'm the 1%. But eventually, he began to talk. and although they were aware of many of his crimes, they hadn't actually connected all of the cases from earlier on to the current murder spree, some of which locals were still in prison being blamed for. But the details Xinhai gave to them cast away any doubt that he was responsible. He told them exact dates and times of every crime he committed. He described the layout of houses, exactly what he'd done to each victim. He told them in horrific detail what weapons he'd used to do it, and even where police would be able to find some of these weapons still buried, which they were later able to dig up exactly where he'd described. Every date, every name, every location matched their case files. He even explained his various methods for avoiding detection to them, such as wearing the shoes that were too big for him, or how he ejaculated into cloths. When asked why he chose his victims, his answers were chilling. He told them there was no real reason. He just picked houses that were isolated and went dark early. He initially claimed that he was motivated by anger towards the woman who had left him years before. Other times, he spoke about society with hatred and disdain, describing it as something he had no interest in being part of. But eventually, he admitted the terrifying truth to them, that really, he just did it for the thrill of it. He enjoyed killing, and each time he did it, it only increased his desire to do it again. While he was awaiting trial, he even told fellow inmates that killing was ordinary and nothing special when they'd asked him why he'd killed so many people. His guards later noted how warm he was toward them, which I find weirdly unsettling. They claim he thanked them profusely for food or for something as simple as clean clothes, telling them, "No one had ever treated me like that." I don't have any sympathy for the man, but you've got to admit there's something profoundly sad about that. While in custody, doctors also confirmed that Xinhai had contracted HIV, likely from one of his victims. Police never revealed when this had happened, or whether any survivors may have been infected. After his arrest, it didn't take long for word to spread that the Hammer Man had finally been caught. Police even travelled to rural villages to announce the news themselves, hoping to end the fear and paranoia that had gripped the countryside. In one village, officers set off firecrackers in an empty field to signal the arrest. That's how Han Fangying, who'd once opened her son's door to find him murdered alongside her 2 grandchildren, first heard the news. Within weeks of his arrest, the ban on reporting was lifted, and as a result, Xinhai's face appeared on the front page of newspapers across the country. They called him the Monster of Hunan, or more simply, the Monster Killer. When his brother, Xinhai, saw one of the papers, he rushed back to Zhengyang County, but his village was already swarming with reporters. That was how the Yang family learned the truth, that Xinhai had murdered 67 people in the most brutal ways imaginable. His father, Zhongguan, asked to see his son, to ask him why he'd done it, but he was just told that Xinhai did not want to see him. So everything he learned about his son's murders came second-hand from the reporters surrounding his home. In February, Zhongguan sent some new clothes to the detention center where his son was being held, but the clothes were returned to him 3 days later with a note that told him Xinhai's sentence had already been carried out. He was dead. And that's because justice moves quickly in China. On February 1st, 2004, Xinhai's trial was held at the Luohe Intermediate People's Court. He arrived in chains for a closed hearing that lasted less than an hour. As he entered the courtroom, he smiled at one of the prison guards before thanking him for taking care of him over the past few weeks. Xinhai showed little emotion as he admitted to his crimes, and he discussed them with a disturbing level of detachment, likening his murders to slaughtering chickens or ducks. He showed no signs of regret, no signs of remorse, no signs that he was anything more than the monster he was being described as in the press. So he was found guilty of all 67 murders, 23 sexual assaults, and 10 counts of serious assault, and sentenced to death. When asked if he wanted to appeal the verdict, he declined, and asked if he wanted to say anything, he replied with a single word: no. On February 14th, less than 2 weeks later, he was driven out to a secluded location near Wuligang village and executed by firing squad. According to reports, a single bullet to the head ended his life. And that was how modern China's worst ever serial killer's story was brought to an end. When Zhongguan arrived at a government compound to collect his son's body, he was told Xinhai had been cremated already and was handed an urn. He refused to take it, and Xinhai's ashes were never collected. Back in Zhengyang, neighbours avoided the Yang family. Conversations ended when they walked by. Zhongguan spent his days sitting at a chair by his window, saying nothing and doing nothing but growing increasingly old and sick under the weight of the guilt and shame of what his son had done. Xinhai's mother, Xiao Yun, cried for months after his death. Her eyesight rapidly deteriorated, but she never sought medical help. She later told a reporter she wished she could have spoken to her son one last time to ask why he'd gone down such a dark path. The family survived by scavenging for food to eat and for scrap to sell from rubbish pits. In one of their last ever interviews with reporters, Xinhai's brother, Xinhai, said he still didn't believe his brother was capable of such crimes, describing him as weak and thin like a monkey. He even said he wanted to investigate the crime scenes himself to find the truth. But his father instantly scolded him for the comment and cut him off, stating, "A case that big? You think they got it wrong? He's been dead for years. Save your strength. Save your money." Interestingly, while officials insisted there was overwhelming forensic evidence tying Xinhai to the 67 murders, they also claimed that it was because he left so little evidence behind that they struggled to catch him for so long. Assuming reports of what he said in his confession are true, there's no real doubt that he was guilty. He gave names, dates, and details only the killer could know. But as is often the case in China, the authorities released almost nothing publicly. A couple of short clips of his confessions were aired on Chinese news stations, no more than a few seconds in total, and details about what specific forensic evidence was found or matched has never been revealed. That isn't to say Xinhai isn't guilty, just that ultimately, we only have their word that the evidence exists for the case against him. As with the Red Dress Killer case we recently explored, by not allowing the press to publish any information about the case until it had been solved, the authorities prevented people from knowing the danger they were in, and from being able to take basic precautions that may have saved their lives, or to even have reported sightings of Xinhai over the years in the villages where he struck. For months, Han Fangying slept with the lights on in her home, as I imagine many others around the country did as well. But eventually she built up the courage to turn them back off and to face the darkness once again. Yang Xinhai the man has been dead for more than 20 years at this point. But Yang Xinhai the monster killer, that shadow's never really gone away. And with that, our exploration of China's most prolific modern serial killer case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and to do all that other stuff that feeds the algorithm gods whatever the hell it is they need to judge the video as worthy. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked in the description as well. I don't have much to offer in the way of perks, so it's really more of a gesture of support at this point. Though you do get to see your name at the end of my videos alongside all the lovely folks popping up on screen in a few seconds. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. October 1993. At the edge of the Ningxia Desert, just outside the city of Yinchuan in northwestern China, the wind sweeps across the old fortress of Zhenbeibao. Dust rolls like smoke through the courtyard as cameras are unpacked, cables dragged across the sand, and a director shouts instructions through the noise. This is the set of An Old Man and His Dog, a film by one of China's most celebrated directors, Xi Jin. A story about loyalty, love, and the bond between a man and his animal. Among the crew stands a young man in a faded denim jacket, wearing dark glasses that hide his eyes. At his side, a yellow wolf dog waits patiently on its leash, calm, obedient, trained to perfection. The dog has just been chosen to star in the movie, and its owner, the man holding the leash, has been hired as its handler. He's even been given a small role in the movie himself, standing in for the lead actor during several key scenes. To everyone here, he seems polite, helpful even, a professional who seems to understand animals better than anyone else. No one looks twice at him. His name is Cheng Peng, and 2 years from now he will make national headlines, and both he and the dog that audiences fall in love with on screen will become part of a story so disturbing that the film itself will be banned. Because behind the calm expression of that young handler lies something darker, a secret he's already begun to bury, a trail of bodies, bones, and brutality. Because Peng is a serial killer, and for years before and after his role in the movie, he had been feeding something much more sinister than meat to his dogs. But on this day, as the camera rolls, nobody knows any of that yet. All they see is a man and his dog, a picture of loyalty, oblivious to the horror waiting to be revealed. This is the story of Cheng Peng, the dog breeder butcher. Cheng Peng was born in 1962 in the city of Yinchuan, the capital of China's Ningxia Autonomous Region. He was the only child of a well-connected family. His mother was attentive and proud. His father was a local government official, what people in China call a cadre, a man with influence, power, and protection. At the time Peng was born, there were no businessmen, no private fortunes, only cadres, and their children walked through life knowing doors would open for them that stayed shut for everyone else. As a result, Peng wanted for nothing, at least in a material sense. There was always food on the table, always new clothes, but comfort didn't make him grateful. It made him restless. He grew up believing he was owed more than the world would ever give him. That sense of entitlement showed early. When other children refused to play the way he wanted, he lashed out. If something didn't go his way, he met it with violence, certain that his father would always step in to smooth things over. There were no consequences, no lessons learned, only a growing awareness that rules were meant for other people, not for him. And his father's presence only reinforced it. According to some accounts, he was so consumed by work that the only times he really paid attention to Peng were after an outburst, after he'd hurt someone or caused trouble that needed cleaning up. It taught Peng something that would follow him for life. That anger and violence got him noticed in ways kindness or obedience never could. As time went on, that pattern only deepened. The older he got, the more vicious he became. Teachers described him as unmanageable, a boy who couldn't be reasoned with. By middle school, he'd been in more fights than anyone could count, yet nothing ever came of it. He was volatile, arrogant, a bully, and everyone still let him get away with it. Until one day when he was around 14, a teacher finally decided to step in, scolding him for tormenting his classmates. Peng snapped. He launched at the man, beating him so badly that the staff had to pull him off. This time, he'd gone too far. And for the first time in his life, there were consequences. The school expelled him. Embarrassed and furious, his father couldn't stop the school from expelling him, but he could make sure no one else heard about it. He pulled strings, silenced teachers, and kept the incident out of official reports. And once again, the lesson Peng learned wasn't humility. It was that rules could be bent and punishment could be avoided. He drifted aimlessly through his teens, gambling, stealing, and boasting about his family's influence and social standing, an influence that continued to open doors for him and to make his problems disappear. Eventually, his father stepped in again. Using his connections, he secured Peng a position at the Ningxia Forestry Research Institute, a respectable government unit where his father also had ties. It was steady work. He repaired tools, helped maintain vehicles, and was assigned a small house inside the institute's residential compound, a quiet courtyard home on the edge of the city. It was a second chance most people didn't get, but one that Peng was all too eager to throw away. He spent his time drinking, smoking, and hanging around with a small circle of shady friends from the city's back streets. His colleagues at the institute found him arrogant and rude. According to them, he constantly acted like the job, and all of them were beneath him. The routine bored him. The rules frustrated him. He thought he deserved more. More freedom, more money, more recognition than the job could ever offer. So he started stealing equipment from the institute and pawning it for quick cash. Not because he really needed it, but because it gave him a sense of power, another way to prove he was untouchable. In 1982, that illusion cracked. He was caught stealing a television set and arrested. But even then, Peng wasn't worried. He'd been protected all his life. He expected his father would just step in again and pay whoever needed paying and make it disappear. But this time, that didn't happen. His father didn't come running. He refused to pull strings or pay anyone off. Instead, he told the police to handle his son like any other criminal, because he was done cleaning up after him. And so he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. When he got out, something in him had changed. He was quieter, colder, but the arrogance, the belief that he was better than everyone else, was still there. Normally, a civil servant convicted of a crime would be immediately fired, but because of who his father was, the institute kept his position open, and when he returned, he was allowed to return to work in the same unit and to continue living in the same house on the compound, almost as if nothing had happened. He kept to himself, rarely engaging with his co-workers, who all felt he continued to treat them with contempt. They described him as moody, cold, and withdrawn. By the late 1980s, Peng had already been suspended at least once, for his attitude and for stealing again. This time, the institute handled it quietly, keeping the police out of it. Some sources claim that was his father's doing, because despite once vowing to let him face the consequences of his actions, his parents still hadn't given up on the idea that he could change. And one of the main ways they tried to achieve this was by arranging a marriage for him, believing it might teach him a sense of respect and responsibility. His new wife was a university-educated researcher at the same forestry institute. She was serious, ambitious, and respected by her peers, everything Peng wasn't. But she was rarely home, often away on long assignments in the field. The marriage was distant from the start. Peng resented her independence, her calm authority, and the quiet respect she commanded among colleagues. The more he compared their reputations, the more he hated it. He spent his days with his old crowd from the back streets, gambling, drinking, drifting, or sitting alone in the courtyard of his government house, smoking and stewing in silence. And that was when he began collecting dogs. They were the only thing he seemed to care about other than himself. Initially, he kept a few as pets. Then he fenced off part of the yard and began breeding wolf dogs, large, aggressive crossbreeds, normally used for guarding warehouses and factory yards. And soon there were more than 20, snarling behind the wire, half-starved and fierce. His terrified neighbours avoided his gate. At night they said they heard gunshots, the sound of Peng firing at chickens and ducks for sport, before tossing their carcasses to his dogs. The noise was constant. Gunfire, barking, the clatter of metal bowls. But because his father was a cader, no one complained. And day by day, he trained his dogs to be more obedient to him and more vicious and violent to everything and everyone else. By the time he turned 26, Peng had basically become a fully formed version of what he always was, a man convinced the world owed him something, and that pain, whether animal or human, was his to command. And soon that belief would lead him to kill. In March 1988, a green carriage train rattled across the dry plains of Gansu, carrying traders, students, and farmers on their way home. Among them sat Peng. Somewhere between Lanzhou and Yinchuan, he struck up a conversation with a young woman sitting across the aisle. Her name was Zhao. She was 23, newly graduated, and heading to Yinchuan to visit her relatives. Despite everything you've heard so far, Peng knew how to present as charming and trustworthy when he wanted to. He told Zhao stories about his work at the Forestry Institute, hinted at his family's government connections, and even bragged that he could help her find a good job in the city. To a young woman from a smaller town, he seemed worldly, the kind of man who knew people and could help open doors for you. By the time the train pulled into Yinchuan, they had already exchanged numbers, and before parting ways, Peng told her he'd love to show her around the city sometime. Polite and curious, Zhao agreed. The next day, he went looking for her and found her exactly where she said she was staying. He took her out to eat, walked around the streets with her, and they even saw a movie together. When night came, he invited her back to his home, an offer she accepted. In that quiet corner of the Forestry Institute compound, behind the high walls and the barking dogs, They spent the night together. Afterward, Zhao returned home to her relatives. But over the following weeks, she came back to see Peng again and again. And soon their relationship, at least in her mind, became serious. She began talking about finding work in Yinchuan and maybe even settling there. But for Peng, the novelty of the affair had already faded. He wanted her gone. On April 13th, 1988, she came to stay the night once more while his wife was away on a field assignment. The next morning, as Zhao washed up in the sink, Peng stood behind her, watching. On the table nearby lay a pair of pliers he'd been using to fix a dog cage. And in that moment, something came over him. He grabbed the pliers and struck Zhao in the back of the head. She collapsed instantly, but Peng wasn't finished. He looped a rope around her neck and pulled until she stopped breathing. The whole thing was over within seconds. For a while he just stood there, staring at what he'd done. But he wasn't panicked. He was excited, flooded by a strange sense of relief. And then, almost methodically, like a man tidying up after a day's work, he began to clean. He dragged her body out into the courtyard, stripped it of clothing, and left it there, planning to deal with it later. But when he came back the next morning, what he saw stopped him cold. The dogs, the pack he'd trained and fed for years, had devoured most of the body. All that remained were bones, scraps of flesh and hair, and some ripped clothing scattered across the yard. He gathered up what bones were left and buried them beneath the cages, smoothing the dirt flat. Any remaining flesh or tissue he shoveled into the kennel troughs for the dogs to finish off. Then he poured fresh concrete over the grave and set up another wire enclosure on top of it. No one in the compound noticed anything unusual. The dogs were loud at night anyway, and they'd learnt to just ignore the noise and commotion from Peng's house over the years. For days afterwards, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Not the murder itself, but how easy it had been. No one had come. No one had asked questions. The body had just disappeared. As far as Zhao's family were concerned, she had stayed behind in the city. They assumed she'd found a job and started a new life. They never could have imagined that her final resting place was just a few feet beneath a kennel of barking dogs. And for a while, nothing happened. Peng went back to work, walked the same corridors at the institute, fed his dogs, smiled at his neighbours. But something inside him had changed. From that moment on, he no longer saw his dogs as just companions. They were accomplices. He could kill anyone he wanted, and they would destroy the evidence for him. He no longer had to hold back his violent impulses. He'd crossed a line he could never come back from. But just like every moment he'd lashed out as a child, there were no consequences for what he'd done. While he hadn't specifically planned to kill Zhao, the rush it gave him was overwhelming. And the idea of doing it again thrilled him. Winter 1990. 2 years had passed since the woman on the train. Inside the Forestry Institute compound, his dogs continued barking through the night, their noise so constant that neighbours barely even acknowledged them. To everyone else, life continued as normal. But Peng had changed. The violence had awakened something in him. Dominating animals no longer satisfied his craving for control. He had seen how far fear and loyalty could be pushed in his dogs. And now he wanted to find out if he could instill that same obedience in other people. He wanted a crew, a small circle of men he could command, who would both fear and admire him. His first recruit was his cousin, Xiao Xiaodan, a naive young temp at the institute. He was younger, impressionable, and eager to make some quick money. When Peng suggested forming a crew to carry out big jobs to make big money, Xiaodan agreed without hesitation. But first he told him that they needed weapons. In October, Peng learned that a subsidiary warehouse at the institute had just received a shipment of equipment which he believed contained guns. So on the night of October 18th, he and Xiaodan climbed onto the roof of the building, prized open the tiles, and slipped inside. In wooden crates they found exactly what they'd hoped for: 8 shotguns and loads of boxes of ammunition. They took everything. Back at Peng's house, they sawed down 2 of the barrels and removed the stocks to make the guns easier to hide. Then they stashed the remainder above a shed. To practice, Peng hung stolen chickens and ducks in the yard and fired until the birds stopped moving. he fed the carcasses to his dogs. His neighbours were already accustomed to loud noises from his property, including gunfire at night. They didn't even look twice. Despite telling his new recruit they were going to carry out big jobs together and get rich, over the following weeks, all they stole were petty goods from the institute and a few private homes. They never fired a shot, and they fled at the sign of any guards. In total, they stole around 10,000 yuan worth of goods. But that December, an opportunity arose to make some real money when Yu Dawei, a younger acquaintance who worked at the Great Wall Trading Company, vented to Peng that his manager Li owed him 3,000 yuan and was refusing to pay. So Peng promised to help collect the debt, his own way of pulling Dawei into the crew and of securing a bigger target. On December 22nd, Peng and Xiaodan took 2 of their guns to the Yinchuan train station, planning to hire a taxi, kill the driver, and steal the car, which they would then use to pick up Dawei and go and visit Mr. Li. They waved down a white minivan, driven by a man named Yang, and asked for a fare out toward Yongning County. As the road narrowed past a brick kiln, Peng saw his opportunity and asked to stop so he could pee. But Yang refused, telling him there was a public toilet further along the route he could use instead. As the minivan continued driving, Peng glanced at his cousin and nodded. So Xiaodan fired his weapon. But with his hands trembling, he missed Yang, tearing through the door instead. Yang thought a tire had burst and jumped out to check. When he saw the hole in the door, Peng suddenly shouted, "Someone's shooting at us, get in!" Panicked, Yang jumped back in and sped back toward the city, straight to Peng's house, where he said they'd settle the fare. As they arrived, Peng offered him some tea to calm his nerves after what had happened, but as soon as Yang stepped through the doorway, Xiaodan raised his gun and fired. The blast hit Yang in the back of the head, killing him instantly. They then wrapped his body in canvas and went looking for Dawei, hoping he'd help deal with it. After all, they'd done this for him, or so they told themselves. But Dawei wasn't home, so the 2 men handled it alone, stripping the corpse and pocketing anything of value. When Xiaodan asked what they should do with the body next, Peng simply looked outside and signaled to the dogs. Xiaodan was speechless. Peng fetched a machete and set to work. Piece by piece, he dismembered the body and tossed the remains to the dogs, who devoured them eagerly, just as he'd promised they would. Whatever scraps they left, he buried behind the kennels. The next morning, Peng gathered the last fragments, the skull and blood-soaked clothes, and dumped them in an unused boiler room behind the institute. The damaged minivan was abandoned overnight in a parking lot in the city. It was Peng's second murder, and the first he'd planned from beginning to end. Two weeks later, on January 8, 1991, Dawei showed up at Peng's house, asking if he'd managed to collect the money yet. Peng poured him a drink, offered dinner, and told him it was time to settle things with Mr. Li, together. So he called Xiaodan and arranged to meet him outside the Nunman bus station. The 3 men climbed into a beige Polonaise taxi driven by a man called Zhang and told him to drive them to a quiet area on the southern outskirts of the city. When they reached a dirt road, Peng told him to stop. As the car slowed, Xiaodan subtly raised his shotgun and fired. But the sudden jolt of the brakes threw his aim off, and the blast shattered the windshield instead. Zhang immediately bolted from the car, shouting for help. But the ground was icy and frozen, making it difficult to run. Peng stepped out, aimed his gun, and fired until he fell to his knees. As the 3 men approached him, Zhang begged for them to spare his life. Instead, Peng handed the gun to Dawei and ordered him to finish the job. Dawei hesitated, gripping the weapon with trembling hands. After a long moment, he lowered it. He couldn't do it, and handed it back. Without hesitation, Peng fired a single shot into Zhang's head, killing him instantly. According to some accounts, he then cut off Zhang's head with a knife, tossing it into the weeds. They then shoved the body into the trunk of the taxi, driving off to go and confront manager Li at his office. Now realizing that they likely intended to kill Mr. Li, Dawei told them that it was too late. The office would be closed, so there'd be no point going there now. So Peng drove him back to his home and let him out. Sensing how shaken he was by what had happened, he warned him to keep quiet about it. He and Xiaodan then drove to somewhere secluded and dug a shallow pit, tossing the corpse into it. But as they drove away, Peng suddenly changed his mind. He turned the car around, dug up the body, and took it home. Like his first two victims, he fed it to the dogs, before burying anything that remained under fresh concrete. Given the taxi's windshield was blown out, they chose to ditch it, abandoning it in the Dongfeng bathhouse parking lot. Even when it was discovered, nobody connected it to the white van and the missing taxi driver from 2 weeks ago. The police investigated the cases, but there were no witnesses, no CCTV footage to review, and not even any bodies. Both cases soon went cold. Within days, Dawei began to distance himself from the group, and before long, he'd cut contact with them entirely, too scared of what he'd witnessed. But Peng wasn't concerned. That fear, he believed, would keep Dawei quiet, and his own arrogance convinced him it always would. 2 drivers were murdered in cold blood, and nobody had noticed. In the evenings, Peng sat in his courtyard smoking, watching the dogs circle under the yellow light. The killings had become effortless. There was no panic, no guilt, no trace of what he'd done. And soon, that hunger, that need to feel the power of it again, would return. But this time, the target wouldn't be a stranger on the road. It would be someone who thought she loved him. After the murders of the 2 drivers, Peng kept his head down. He went back to his usual routine at the Forestry Institute and continued as if everything was completely normal. Then, without fanfare, he filed for unpaid leave, an arrangement that let him keep his government title while living entirely on his own terms. He told his colleagues he wanted to go into business, and on paper it sounded respectable enough. Around the compound, word spread that he was breeding wolf dogs to sell for security work, a small venture that seemed to make sense to everyone. And for a while, it worked. The barking, the late nights, the comings and goings. It all looked like a man keeping busy, building a trade. On the surface, he seemed calmer, more focused, almost reformed. But behind closed doors, nothing had changed. He spent his days drinking and gambling, drifting between card rooms and backstreet bars. In the courtyard, he lingered for hours with his dogs, feeding them, training them, watching them rip at meat with a fascination that bordered on obsession. Because beneath that calm exterior, the darkness hadn't gone. It was simply waiting, like one of his dogs, trained to obey until he called upon it. He'd learned how easy it was to kill, and how intoxicating it could be. All it needed now was a reason. In the winter of 1991, the brightest place in the city wasn't the government square or the new hotels. It was the Tongfuju ballroom, a swirl of red lights, cigarette haze, and music from a battered tape deck. That was where Peng met Liu, a lively factory worker in her early 20s. After seeing her on the dance floor, Peng approached her between songs. He put on his mask of charm as he smiled and laughed with her, before offering to buy her a drink. By the end of the evening, they'd agreed to meet again the next night. And when they met the next night, she went home with him. And over the next few weeks, they danced, drank, and stayed the night together on multiple occasions. But then one evening, between cigarettes and laughter, she said something that changed everything. She told him that she was trying to arrange a wedding with her fiancé, but money was tight. If he could lend her 3,000 yuan, she said, she could finally move forward with it. She likely believed Peng was wealthy, because he often boasted about his father's position and exaggerated the success of his barely established dog business. But her request hit a nerve. It made him feel used, like she'd only ever seen him as a source of money. She never saw his anger, though. He smiled, told her to give him 10 days, and promised he'd have the money ready. Overjoyed, she thanked him, kissed him goodnight, and left. For the next 10 days, Peng planned. He stopped feeding several of his dogs, leaving them hungrier than ever. He waited until his wife was gone on another field assignment. Then, on the agreed night, Liu returned. They ate dinner, danced to a cassette on the old player. They even slept together. The next morning, as Liu stood by the table fixing her hair in the mirror, Peng watched her reflection. It reminded him of the moment he'd watched Zhao years earlier. So ordinary, so unguarded. He lifted one of the sawed-off shotguns he'd hidden beneath the bed, aimed at the back of her head, and the blast echoed across the compound. But to the neighbours, it was nothing unusual, nothing they didn't hear every other day from his house. Liu fell where she stood. Peng stripped her body, tied a rope around her neck, and dragged her outside and into his neighbour's yard, a space he'd borrowed while his neighbour was away. It was also where his starved, aggressive dogs were waiting. He locked the gate and left. 3 days later, he came back to find the yard silent. All that remained of Lu were gnawed bones, scraps of hair, and the shredded rope. He gathered what he could find and carelessly tossed her skull onto the roof of his own house. Then he buried the remaining bones beneath the kennels and burnt the clothes. He didn't care that the neighbour or anyone else could have entered the yard during the days he left her body out in the open. He didn't worry that someone might see the skull on his roof. As far as he was concerned, he was untouchable. Nobody knew about his affair. Nobody came asking questions, and just like before, it was like nothing had ever even happened. By 1993, the business that had once been a cover story had become real. What started as an excuse for Peng, a way to explain the noise, the dogs, the constant activity, had turned into something that looked respectable. People came and went from his courtyard, curious about the wolf dogs behind the wire. He spoke with authority about bloodlines, temperament, and training, always the expert, always in control. Soon he wasn't just the odd man with too many dogs. He was a breeder, a businessman, a man who seemed to know what he was doing. That spring, the western desert outside of Yinchuan stirred with excitement. A famous director, Xie had arrived to film An Old Man and His Dog, a sentimental story about loyalty and loss. The set was built among the crumbling walls of the ancient Zhenbeibao fortress, a maze of courtyards and battlements left from the Ming dynasty. Trucks rolled in with lights and props. In the early 1990s, film was still a rare spectacle in rural China. When a movie screen went up, people would walk for miles to see it. So when the film crew arrived in Ningxia, excitement swept the region and crowds gathered just to watch the cameras roll. But there was a problem. The production couldn't find the right dog. Xie wanted an animal with presence, an obedient dog that could convey gentleness, patience, and sorrow. They placed ads on the radio, on TV, and in newspapers, resulting in endless auditions. For days, villagers, breeders, and hobbyists lined up at the gates. But he rejected every one of them. None had the look or temperament he wanted. Without the dog, many scenes couldn't be shot, and nobody knew how long the schedule would have to be delayed, or how expensive it would get if they couldn't find it soon. But just as they were starting to panic, a man arrived in a denim jacket and dark glasses, leading a dog by a rope. The animal was lean, bright-eyed, and obedient. It responded to every gesture, every click of the man's tongue. Xie knew instantly that he'd found his star. That man was Peng, and that dog was one of the many that had already tasted human flesh. Peng was hired on the spot as the dog's handler, and the director even offered him a small role in the movie to thank him, doubling for the lead actor in a few long-shot scenes, including a scene driving a horse and cart across the dunes. During the weeks of filming, Peng was almost unrecognizable. He was attentive, polite, and eager to please. The crew saw only a calm, reliable animal handler, a man who seemed to understand dogs better than most people could ever dream of. When the film wrapped and was released the following year, it was an instant hit. It was labelled as one of the best films of the year by Chinese critics, and won numerous awards. Audiences across China were moved by its story, praising the dog in particular for its performance. And in Yinchuan, everyone wanted to meet the man who had trained it and to take pictures with the animal star. Peng soaked in the attention. He told stories about working with the crew, about the famous actors he'd met, about how his dog had performed perfectly, often only needing a single take. The local papers even mentioned him by name, with small magazines running blurbs about the breeder from Ningxia who trained the film's star. His business flourished as a result. Farmers came to buy pups from him. Security companies came to find guard dogs. The same animals that had eaten his victims were now earning him praise and money. Among the many people who came to see him was someone from the film crew, a married woman called Yu. She was 7 years older than him and seemed to be genuinely curious about his animals. Conversations about their time working on the movie soon turned into deep chats about life, and before long she was coming to visit him regularly. Yu had admired Peng during the shoot, fascinated by his composure and the way he handled his dog. She told him that he seemed like a real man, the kind who knew what he wanted and didn't care what anyone thought. They became so close that Peng even gave her a key to his house, telling her she could come by any time his wife was away. For a while, the affair gave Peng that sense of control he always craved again, the thrill of being wanted, the comfort of being admired. But then one day, everything changed. In April 1994, Yu called Peng. She told him she'd been away in Hebei after her father's death, and before returning home again, she wanted to see him, as there was something important she needed to tell him. They met the next day. After having dinner at one of the best restaurants in the city, they sang karaoke together. It was all smiles and laughter. By midnight, they were back at Peng's house. As she lay against him with her head on his chest, she quietly told him that she was pregnant, and that the baby was his. Peng pretended to be happy, reassuring her and holding her until she fell asleep. But he had no intention of having a child. At dawn, Yu got up to wash. She sat in front of the mirror, humming softly as she began to do her makeup. Behind her, Peng lifted the sawed-off shotgun from beneath the bed and aimed it at her back. There was no hesitation, no fear, just... She fell forward, her face still turned toward the mirror, looking into the reflection to see his shadow leering behind her. Then, Peng lowered the gun, knelt down beside her, and strangled her with his bare hands. When she'd stopped moving, he opened her handbag and took her cash, her gold earrings, and her necklace, and went outside. Beneath a grapevine in his yard, he dug a shallow pit and lowered the body inside. He didn't dismember her, didn't feed her to his dogs. This time, he just buried her body. He covered the grave with earth and burned a small stack of joss paper, thin ceremonial sheets meant to send offerings to the dead, as his own twisted gesture of farewell. And just like with his previous 4 victims, nobody came looking for her. But every pattern breaks eventually, and the next time he pulled the trigger, it would finally mark the beginning of his end. A month after Yu vanished, a man in glasses rolled up to Peng's gate on a bicycle and stared at him for a beat, as if he was trying to remember something. Eventually he said, "Don't you recognize me?" before announcing his name as Ma Wei from junior high. Wei had heard Peng was breeding dogs, he said. He was just about to purchase more than 10 Tibetan Mastiffs and needed advice on how to train them and how to handle a pack. Peng nodded along, his mind already doing the maths. Tibetan Mastiffs sold for real money. So as soon as Wei pedaled off, Peng phoned Xiaodan and told him there might be an opportunity coming their way. He'd arranged for Wei to come back the next day on his way to pick the dogs up, meaning he would likely have a lot of money when he arrived. But when Wei returned to his house, he stepped out of a police car, wearing his uniform. He was a police officer. Whatever plan Peng had in mind died immediately. After humouring Wei and talking about dogs with him, he let him walk away alive, because even Peng wasn't arrogant enough to think he could get away with murdering a police officer. But he wasn't the only old face who was drawn in by Peng's newfound fame and reputation. First there was another former classmate, Li Sanwei. Sanwei worked in a nitrogen fertilizer plant and had vented to Peng about his low pay, late wages, and his general anger at the world. When Peng asked if he'd do anything for money, Sanwei said yes without blinking. Zhang Ming was also a former classmate who crossed paths with him. Ming had become a deputy manager at a trading company in the city's new development zone, and at first the reunion was friendly, 2 men from the same school talking business and money. But one evening over drinks, Ming mentioned something that lit a spark in Peng's brain. He had raised 1.5 million yuan for a cashmere wool deal. That number drowned out everything else in Peng's head, every other target, every other plan. So he invited Ming to his home for dinner in early January of 1995, saying he wanted to discuss an investment opportunity. When Ming arrived, Sanwei was also at the house. The 3 men sat down to eat dinner, talk business, and reminisce over their shared past. But as Ming sipped tea, he suddenly felt his eyelids sink. The tea had been laced with sleeping pills by Peng, and as soon as the drugs began taking effect, he pulled out one of his sawed-off shotguns and thrust it into Sanwei's hands. He told him to shoot Ming to show that he was serious about doing anything for money. But Sanwei's bravado quickly collapsed. He shook his head and passed the gun back. So Peng fired it himself. Terrified, Sanwei helped him drag the body into the yard, where it was buried beneath the grapevine, alongside Yu. Then, Peng took Ming's keys and went straight to his home with Sanwei, who was too frightened to say no. Ming kept a separate flat near the development zone, away from his family. So when Peng and Sanwei let themselves in with his keys, the place was empty. They searched every drawer and cabinet, looking for the 1.5 million yuan that Ming had bragged about before. But there was no fortune waiting for them. Just a few hundred yuan in cash, a small stack of bonds, and a new pager on the dresser. Peng snatched the money and bonds, clipped the pager to his belt, and walked out as if it were his. When it was done, he told Sanwei to go home and to keep his mouth shut. He didn't have to say what would happen if he didn't. The next evening, Peng called Ming's home from a payphone. When his wife answered, Peng tried to disguise his voice, claiming he was a business partner as he questioned her about the money. But Ming's wife just told him she didn't know anything about that stuff and that he should just call her husband. But something about it felt off to her, so she called her husband's business partner, Mr. Wang, to check what was going on. Mr. Wang told her he hadn't seen Ming for a couple of days, but offered to page him and check that everything was okay. A few minutes after he paged Ming, he received a call back. But it wasn't his business partner on the phone, it was Peng. Peng introduced himself, giving his full name, and then he told him that Ming had gone south on business. He'd needed to borrow 3,000 yuan from him, so he'd left the pager as collateral. He wasn't sure when he'd be back. Mr. Wang didn't buy the story, and neither did Ming's wife. On January 11th, Mrs. Zhang filed a missing person report with the police. It didn't take long for the authorities to hone in on Peng. Ming had told his wife he was going to meet him before he'd seemingly vanished, and Peng had identified himself by name to Mr. Wang on the phone. On January 16th, they brought him in for questioning. But Peng was calm and collected, sticking to his story, though he expanded on it a little. Peng told them that Ming was in Yunnan doing a drug deal, alongside relatives from Lanzhou. This was why he hadn't told Mr. Wang or his wife about it, and why he'd had to ask him for money, leaving his pager and bonds as collateral. When the officers checked his story, they found nothing. He did have relatives from Lanzhou, but they simply laughed at the notion that Ming would run drugs or disappear on any sort of business trip without telling his wife. With it clear to everyone that Peng was lying, he switched tactics and suddenly went silent. He refused to cooperate. He wouldn't give them the confession they wanted. He wouldn't answer any more of their questions. He wouldn't even eat the food they gave him. After 2 days, they still had nothing solid enough to hold him. So he was escorted back to his house by officers to assist in a search of his property. He wasn't even in cuffs. As they approached the gate, the yard erupted. More than 20 wolf dogs pounded against the wire fencing, barking and snarling. Peng offered to go through the gate first so he could lock the dogs inside their kennels. But as he slipped into the yard, he suddenly bolted. The officers rushed into the yard to pursue him, but his snarling dogs swarmed them, holding them back. Peng then vaulted onto the kennel roof, and in one fluid movement, he disappeared over the far wall and into the scrub. By the time the officers had fought through the barking dogs, he was gone. After finally securing the animals, they entered the house anyway. The smell was what hit them first, a thick metallic tang embedded in the wood and plaster. Dark dried flecks were on the door frames, lampshades, and even the ceiling. They were suspicious looking enough for them to take samples to be analysed. Within hours, the flecks were confirmed to be human blood. So an entire team descended on the property. It didn't take long for the 8 hidden shotguns to be discovered, which all still had their serial numbers intact. They were quickly identified as the same batch stolen from a Forestry Institute warehouse years earlier. Out in the yard, a police dog pawed at a freshly dug patch of soil. Spades went in, and the body of Jiang Ming came out. Their missing person case had just become a murder case. But then they found another trench, and in it, another body. A woman's remains, already deep into decay. The more they searched the property, the more they found. They began uncovering the buried bones of Peng's other victims in bundles, some under his kennels, others in the neighbour's yard, a skull on the roof. But most disturbingly, it was immediately clear that all of the bones had been gnawed and chewed. There were even human bones still laying inside the kennels. Room by room, Pit by pit, the story assembled itself. This was a graveyard, one that had taken years to build. It wasn't just a murder case, it was a serial killer case, and one of the most disturbing that the nation had ever seen. That same day, January 18th, 1995, the Public Security Bureau issued a citywide bulletin, and the manhunt had begun. Police checkpoints sprang up immediately, covering all the main exits from the city. Officers searched trains, buses, and rural roads, but Peng had already vanished. In the early hours after his escape, he fled along the Yinggu Highway, keeping to the edges of farmland and avoiding major roads until he found what he was looking for, somewhere quiet and warm to hide. A few miles outside the city, he stumbled across a school for the deaf that was closed for the winter. Beneath one of the buildings ran a heating trench, still pumping warm air through the pipes. He climbed down, pressed his hands to the metal, and decided to stay. For the next 10 days, Peng hid underground. He purchased food from a nearby stall, drank water from a leaky tap, and tried to wait out the search above. When the winter cold became unbearable and he began running out of money for supplies, he set off into the night. He convinced a farmer to sell him an old cotton coat and hat and kept heading north, telling anyone who asked that he had been cheated out of his savings. Along the roadside, he saw his own face staring back at him from wanted posters nailed to telephone poles. The Public Security Bureau had issued a 30,000 yuan reward for his capture, and by that point, they had expanded the manhunt for him nationwide. But Peng wasn't the only one being hunted. Investigators had begun tracing his connections, and one name kept coming up: his cousin, Xiao Xiaodan. They learnt that the two had been inseparable. Witnesses told them Xiaodan was often at Peng's house and had been seen firing guns with him. Yinchuan police tracked him down to Shenzhen, which was more than 1,000 miles away, and arrested him on January 29th. During questioning, Xiaodan confessed to everything. He admitted that he and Peng had stolen the guns and ammo from the Forestry Institute warehouse, and that alongside Yu Dawei, they had ambushed and murdered 2 taxi drivers back in 1990. As a result of his statements, Dawei was arrested a couple of days later as well. With his 2 accomplices in custody and a clearer picture of Peng's crimes emerging, the search for him intensified. But Peng just kept moving. He crossed into Inner Mongolia, boarding a bus under a false name, Bai Baoshan. By pure coincidence, years later the nation would be haunted by another serial killer with that actual name. He checked into a roadside inn in Otog Front Banner before moving again to the nearby town of Uxin Banner. It was Chinese New Year, so most businesses were shut and most of the streets were empty. Peng wandered until he found a small family restaurant run by a man named Shu and his son. He told them a story about how he'd been robbed, claiming he couldn't walk properly and needed somewhere to rest. Pitying him, they gave him a meal and a bed for the night, warning that he'd have to leave in the morning. The next day, he met the bus station watchman. Believing his story, he introduced him to an elderly healer, a self-styled witch doctor who was looking for an assistant. The healer offered him a place to stay in exchange for help with chores. For the next 2 months, Peng lived as the witch doctor's apprentice, tending a small fire and carrying supplies from the market. He also worked occasional shifts at a nearby coal mine to earn some money, keeping his head down. But he lived in constant fear of being recognised. So on March 10th, he broke into a local police station, hoping to find a gun to arm himself. He didn't find any firearms inside, only pistol magazines, but he did locate over 100 ID cards. He kept any that he felt resembled himself and burned the rest. 9 days later, he struck again. He forced open the doors of 2 government offices, but this time he found only bullets. And by then, word of the break-ins and rumours of a stranger in the area had reached the local authorities, leading to an increase in patrols. So Peng slipped away once more, this time heading south toward Shanxi province. Eventually, after drifting aimlessly for a number of days and struggling to stay hidden, he decided to go back to the school where he knew it was safe and warm. But when he returned to it, it had been locked shut and the heating had been turned off. Unsure where else to hide, he travelled to Pingliang and checked into a cheap hotel using one of the stolen ID cards. For 10 days, he stayed there living off what little cash he had left. But when he ran out of money, he decided to risk one last move, this time to Xi'an. He had a nephew who managed a sandcasting factory in the city's Yueyang district. But when he arrived on April 13th, his nephew wasn't there. Instead, a distant relative he'd never met before welcomed him into the factory, poured him tea, and asked him to wait for his nephew to return. But as the man looked closer at him, something clicked in his head. He'd seen his face before, on a wanted poster offering a reward of 30,000 yuan. Making an excuse to leave the room, he told one of the guards to call the police before returning to Peng to keep him talking. Minutes later, 6 plainclothes officers arrived at the factory. 2 of them entered the office, pretending to be customers, and as soon as Peng turned to look at them, they lunged at him. He barely had time to stand before he was slammed to the floor and handcuffed. After 85 days on the run, the killer who had fed his victims to his dogs was now shackled, thin and expressionless. Peng barely spoke during the journey back to Yinchuan, staring out the window as they drove him through the same streets where his wanted posters still hung. He was immediately charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, and Xiaodan and Dawei were also both charged for their roles as his accomplices. At his trial, Xiaodan openly admitted that he had assisted Peng in multiple robberies, including stealing the shotguns from the Forestry Institute, and even confessed that he had killed the 2 taxi drivers with his cousin. Dawei also confirmed his involvement in the taxi driver murders during his trial. Like his accomplices, Peng didn't deny what he'd done. But in stark contrast to them, he bragged and boasted about it, as if he was proud of it. He claimed the 3 women he'd murdered had all interfered with his family life, and so deserved to die. The 3 men he'd murdered, on the other hand, were all killed because he wanted something from them. Money, a car, whatever. He confessed without hesitation to all 6 murders, gloating that the investigators would never find all the body parts because he'd fed them to his dogs. Reporters who were allowed into the courtroom described him as cold, calm, and seeming almost bored, as if the entire thing was somehow beneath him. When asked if he regretted any of it, he simply said, no. So the judge pressed him further, asking what he felt after killing so many people. Peng's reply was another single word: happiness. When a reporter later asked him if he ever felt afraid living among the corpses of his victims, Peng shrugged and remarked, "I don't believe in ghosts or gods." Outside the courthouse, the public outrage was immense. This wasn't just a murderer, this was a man who had taken pleasure in his violent depravity, whose victims had included lovers, friends, and strangers. But what horrified people even more was that one of the dogs he'd used to dispose of his victims had once been loved by audiences across China. People had come from all over the country to see it and take pictures with it. The revelation sent shockwaves through the country. The gentle creature that had made filmgoers cry was now known to have eaten human flesh. Almost overnight, an old man and his dog was pulled from circulation. The film was instantly banned, and it would be almost 20 years before it would be seen again. On September 27, 1995, the Yinchuan Intermediate People's Court held a public sentencing rally. In front of a packed crowd, Peng and Xiaodan were stripped of their political rights for life and sentenced to death. Dawei received a suspended death sentence for his smaller role in the crimes. As we've seen before, justice moves quickly in China. So minutes later, Peng and Xiaodan were escorted to the execution ground outside the city, and both men were immediately shot. That same day, every single one of Peng's dogs, including the yellow dog who'd starred in the film, were executed by a firing squad. The authorities feared they might have grown accustomed to the taste of human flesh and were worried they might attack someone if left alive. In the years that followed, people in Yinchuan stopped saying Peng's name out loud. But sometimes, when an old man and his dog came up in conversation, the air in the room would seem to change, as if everyone suddenly remembered what lay behind that story. The man, the kennel, the yellow dog. When the film was quietly re-released decades later, Peng's name had been erased from the credits, and every frame he appeared in had been cut away. But even so, few could bring themselves to watch it. Because no matter how moving the story of loyalty and devotion was meant to be, everyone knew the truth. That the dog on screen, the one audiences had once adored, had fed on human flesh, and that its master, smiling just off camera, had long since lost every trace of his own humanity. Peng had once said that he didn't believe in ghosts or gods, but after what he did, many people believed that wherever he went next, both were waiting for him. And with that, our deep dive into the case of Cheng Peng, the dog breeder butcher, comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and to do all the other stuff that feeds the bellies of the ever-so-hungry algorithm gods. I'm trying hard to keep putting out videos once a week, but I'm just so behind at the moment. My videos are taking me longer and longer to research, write, and make. I might not be the most talented creator in the world, but I'm trying my best to keep up the quality and to keep improving all the time. And I just can't produce videos at the speed I want to right now. So apologies if I'm a little bit inconsistent at the moment. It doesn't help that all of YouTube's algorithm changes over the last few months have made everything wildly unpredictable either. But anyway, if you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked in the description down below. They're really just gestures of support right now, so don't feel any obligation to join either, though you will get to see your name on screen if you do, alongside all the lovely folks coming up in a few seconds. Oh, and I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to tell you to check out some of my other videos at this point too, right? I never remember to do that, and I really should start doing that. If the algorithm gods ask, tell them I did it. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. June 2nd, 1998. Wuhan, one of China's largest cities, is winding down for the night. The crowds have thinned, the streets are quiet, and the heat still clings to the air like a second skin. It's just before 11 p.m, and in the Wuchang district, the only sounds are the occasional rattle of a bicycle or the dull hum of distant traffic. And beneath the glow of the street lamps, a woman walks alone. Her name is Xiao Chen, and she's just finished a shift at the new internship she's started, hopeful that she'll have a proper job waiting for her there once she graduates. She gets closer and closer to the safety of her home, completely unaware that a man has been following her the entire time. When he reaches her, he pulls out a knife and tells her not to scream. But overwhelmed by shock and fear at the sight of the blade, Xiao can't help herself, and so she screams at the top of her lungs. And although she couldn't have known it at the time, in doing so, she's just sealed her own fate, because the man had only intended to rob her. But upon hearing her scream, it sends something running through his body. Something he'll later describe as a mix of fear and excitement. An urge, a kind of rage he'll say he can't explain. Overtaken by this sudden rush, the man drags her into an alley and assaults her, and as she continues screaming, he finds himself completely overtaken by his urges, and he plunges the knife into her. Once, twice, 3 times. The more she screams, the more excited he gets. The more he feels the rush, the more he stabs her. By the time she stops moving, he stabbed her 38 times. Her chest and back are torn apart, and her internal organs are destroyed. Afterwards, covered in blood and unsure what to do, the man runs back to his motel in the darkness, where he washes himself clean. When police arrive at the scene, they find no suspect, no witnesses, and no clear motive. Just a scene so brutal that a young police trainee vomits the second he sees Xiao's body, later describing her back as resembling a beehive. With next to no forensic evidence found, it isn't long before the case starts to turn cold. And for a while, it just seems like a one-off. A horror without explanation. But this was only the beginning. Because roughly 1 year later, the man responsible would re-emerge from the shadows to begin one of the most disturbing murder sprees in the country's history. From 1999 until he was finally caught in 2001, many more women would be stabbed, assaulted, and even mutilated, with at least 13 of them being killed by the monster responsible. With the attacks spread across 2 provinces and no clear pattern, all investigators knew for certain was that their serial killer was targeting women who were alone, almost always in the hours before dawn. and for a long time, the killer remained a phantom. Although nobody knew his name, a rumor began to claim that almost all of his victims were wearing red when they were attacked. So the public soon gave him a new one. This is the story of the Red Dress Killer. Before we get back into the story, I just want to take a quick moment to say up front that a lot of the information used to write this script has come from non-English sources. For some reason, I had it in my head that this was a really famous case before I started going into it properly, but from what I could see, it has next to no coverage outside of China, beyond a few vague details and a short article in the Times. Even the English language books I found that mentioned the case didn't spend more than a page or two on it. So to find all the specifics, I've pretty much had to exclusively use Chinese sources that have been translated into English. As usual, this means there's a high likelihood of me making some mistakes and getting some of the information wrong. If any of you know what high-profile case I might have been confusing this one with, let me know down below. But anyway, when I started looking into this one, I thought it was an interesting case to cover, even if it wasn't whatever I actually had in my mind. And while I've got you, don't forget to like the video early to help it out in the algorithm. And if you're new to the channel and find the case interesting, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other true crime content. With all that said then, let's get back to the story. The mid-sized city of Yueyang in southern China rarely made the news. With the Yangtze River running along its edge and factories dotting the skyline, the city was best known for its barges and cranes, not for violence. But in the spring of 1999, something quietly shifted. It started on April 4th, when a young woman was attacked just before dawn. Her name was Yan Sanying, and she was a 31-year-old factory worker employed by the Yueyang Water Transport Company. Living close to her workplace, she left home around 5 a.m. that morning to begin her shift. As she walked alone along Yunxiang Lane, near the city's General Trade Union building, a man began following her. Only a few minutes from her front door, he attacked her. Without warning, without saying a word, he lunged at her with his knife. And as she screamed, his excitement only grew, causing him to stab her over and over again. And by the time he was finished, he'd stabbed her 16 times. When police arrived at the scene, they found her body lying in a pool of blood. There were no witnesses, and there were no signs of sexual assault. At first, the investigators considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong, but nothing appeared to have been stolen from her. So they then began looking into potential disputes or conflicts she might have had in her life. But they didn't find any, and with so little evidence, the case stalled. Occurring a year later in a different city, they had no reason to connect Yan's murder to the 1998 killing of Xiao. Although on paper the two cases had a lot of similarities, it never occurred to anyone involved that the attacks were anything other than one-off senseless murders. In fact, it's unlikely anyone involved in Yan's case even knew about Xiao's murder. But over the following months, 2 more women were murdered in eerily similar circumstances in the city of Yueyang. While the specific details about who they were, and exactly how and where in the city they were killed, seem impossible to find, the basic facts are clear. All 3 victims were women. All of them were alone when they were killed. All were stabbed repeatedly, and all of the attacks occurred before dawn. In all 3 cases, there was no clear motive, just a sudden, overwhelming burst of violence. From what I can tell, despite now having 3 similar murders in the same city in the same year, the police never publicly acknowledged that a pattern might be forming. Each case was treated in isolation. Investigators followed standard procedure, but there were no warnings issued, and there was no effort to inform the public. And part of that may have come down to how crime was, and still is, reported in China. Newspapers there typically don't cover violent crimes unless the suspect has already been caught. So in 1999, the people of Yueyang had no idea what was happening. There were no headlines, and most residents hadn't even heard about the murders, not until years later. But inside the investigation, a few detectives were starting to worry. At least, that's what they said in hindsight. They claimed that the attacks didn't seem random. Not really. That even then, they felt there was method behind the violence. A focus on women walking alone, always attacked with a knife, with nothing stolen and no clear motive. Almost as if the killer didn't want anything from them, other than the act itself. Looking back now, it's easy to see why the problem was only going to get worse, because China, at that time, was undergoing a massive transformation. For decades under Chairman Mao, life had been tightly controlled. Every adult belonged to a work unit. Neighborhood committees monitored everything from your mail to your dinner guests. It was a system so restrictive that even bicycle theft seemed risky. But by the late 1990s, that world was fading. People were moving freely between cities and provinces. Surveillance was looser. Society was changing fast. And for the first time, it was possible to be anonymous. Especially in industrial cities like Yueyang, where migrants were coming and going, and where a stranger could blend in without raising any red flags. Whatever the case, by the end of the year, 3 women were dead, and the man responsible had learned the most important lesson of all: that in this new China, it was possible to kill and simply vanish. And while the brutality of the killings should have sparked fear, Yueyang remained largely quiet. There were whispers, of course, of women found stabbed in the dark, of strange men seen lingering near factory dormitories and alleyways, but the panic hadn't set in yet. That would come later. Because in the year that followed, the murders wouldn't just continue. They'd escalate. Although no other lives were claimed in 1999 by the killer, there are multiple reports of attacks and attempted attacks, though the exact timeline of these crimes is a little unclear. It wasn't until February 2000 that he claimed the life of his next victim. And when he struck again, the violence wasn't just as bad as before, it was worse. On February 13th, around 4:30 in the morning, a 33-year-old woman called Zhong left her home as usual. She worked at the Yueyang Petroleum Company and was known to suffer from a mental illness of some kind. Before she could get far, she was forced at knife point into a nearby stairwell inside the Zhangyun Transport Dormitory complex. There, the killer stabbed her 25 times, and when it was over, he mutilated her body, slicing off her right nipple. Then he stole what little money she had on her, less than 10 yuan. Just 10 days later, he killed again. On the morning of February 23rd, a 47-year-old woman named Li was out jogging near her home as part of her usual daily routine. But that morning, the killer was waiting. He pounced without warning, lunging out from a side path and grabbing her by the throat with both hands. As he choked her, he demanded all her valuables. She handed over what little cash she had on her, and the moment he let go to pocket the money, she took her chance and ran. Enraged that his victim was trying to escape, he pulled out his knife and gave chase. When he caught up with her, he stabbed her over and over with a level of violence that had now become his signature, 25 times in total. And when she was dead, he simply walked away. He returned to the small motel where he was staying, washed the blood from his hands, and went to sleep as if nothing had happened. With 5 brutal and eerily similar murders of women in the span of a year, it had become impossible for the Yueyang police to keep viewing them as unrelated incidents. And by then, it wasn't just the police who were noticing the pattern. The public was catching on too, especially after one chilling detail came to light. Li had been wearing red when she was killed. Suddenly, a rumor swept through the city and quickly spread to surrounding areas that a deranged killer was targeting women who wore red clothing or had long hair. Within weeks, women were cutting their hair short, hiding their red garments, and avoiding the streets after dark. And that's when his nickname was born, the Red Dress Killer. Then, on June 12th, once again at 4:30 in the morning, a 34-year-old woman was walking through a quiet area of the city when she was ambushed. As she screamed out and tried to fight back, the Red Dress Killer stabbed her 6 times before fleeing, perhaps being interrupted by a passerby. As a result, she wasn't dead when he left her lying in the street. She was rushed to hospital, but unfortunately, before she could provide the police with any useful information about her attacker, she died from her injuries. The following month, on July 22nd, another life was claimed. The victim was a cafeteria worker at the Yueyang train station called Li. That night, she'd stayed out late playing mahjong with her co-workers. At around 2 a.m., she left to walk home alone. While she was likely aware of the rumors of the Red Dress Killer at this point, her home was less than 100 meters away. But even with such a small journey, she never made it. Just before reaching her apartment, the killer attacked her, stabbing her to death and stealing 2,000 yuan in cash before running off into the night. With 7 murders in just over a year in such a small city, regardless of whether the newspapers were discussing the case or not, everyone now knew about it. And everyone was terrified. Facing immense pressure, the Yueyang Public Security Bureau assembled a special task force to hunt down and catch the man responsible, utilizing hundreds of police officers. They even brought in top experts from the Ministry of Public Security, including veteran criminal profiler Zhang Xin. As well as the 7 murder victims, there were many others who had been attacked and survived. Supposedly, if they didn't resist or scream when he demanded their belongings, he tended to let them go. And this allowed the task force to develop a composite sketch of their suspect. The party secretary of Yueyang, Yu Laishan, took personal control of the case, coordinating a public reward of 200,000 yuan for any information leading to the arrest of the red dress killer. By the end of the year, despite the overwhelming attention now focused on the case from both the police and the public, no meaningful breakthroughs had been made, and the task force was no closer to unmasking the red dress killer. In January or early February 2001, he claimed his 8th victim, though I wasn't able to find out anything about that case at all. And then, in the early hours of February 16th, he struck again. This time, it was in the Willipai area of Yueyanglu district, not far from the city centre. A woman in her early 30s was returning home after a late-night game of mahjong, carrying her purse and her mobile phone. She actually made it all the way back to her apartment and was in the process of climbing the steps to her front door when the killer made his move. As she reached the top of the stairs, he lunged. With his left hand, he covered her mouth and nose. With his right, he pressed a knife into her back and told her to hand over everything she had. She did as she was ordered, giving him roughly 4,000 yuan in cash as well as her phone. She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She did exactly what he asked her to, but that didn't save her. He stabbed her anyway, over and over. Then he vanished into the night like he always did. Except this time, he'd made a mistake. Because while the police had very little to go on in the earlier murders, this time they had a lead: the stolen mobile phone. Using new investigative tools, police began tracking the device, and the signal ultimately led them to a man named Duan Guocheng. It's not clear exactly how that identification happened. Duan already had a substantial criminal record, so it's possible they traced the phone's location and cross-checked for known offenders in the area. Or maybe it was more direct. In China, all SIM cards are registered to a person's real name and ID number. So if Duan had inserted his own SIM into the victim's phone, the authorities would have known who he was the moment it connected to the network. Duan was a 29-year-old local man from Yueyang who had spent most of his life in detention centers and prisons for theft and robbery. With a potential name and face to the phantom who had haunted the city for nearly 2 years, police moved quickly. Immediately after identifying him, 6 officers arrived at the modest 3-room apartment in Yueyang, where Duan lived with his parents. Duan's mother, Hu Yunxiang, begged them to tell her what was going on as they entered the apartment, but the officers refused to tell her anything. They just sat quietly under the family's faded poster of Chairman Mao and waited. As they hoped, just before dawn, Duan returned to the apartment. But before he entered the house, he spotted the police officers through the window and ran. They chased him through nearby alleys and into a local vegetable market. But Duan knew these streets like the back of his hand, and once again, he managed to slip away. Only then did they break the news to his mother that her son was wanted for the murder of 9 women, as well as up to 70 violent attacks and robberies in the city. With Duan now identified as the killer, the Yueyang task force wasted no time. They issued a national wanted bulletin with his photo and a physical description. Short, pale, slightly overweight, with small eyes, a square face, and a surgical scar on the left side of his abdomen. They learnt that he spent most of his nights staying in motels and guest houses, using fake IDs to remain hidden and anonymous. So they also provided a list of potential aliases, which included the name Hu Cheng. Officers chased leads across the province, but they always seemed one step behind, and every day that passed without his arrest, public fear kept growing. In such a small city, 9 murders was unthinkable. The killer became something of a legend, a dark figure locals whispered about. Some even stopped referring to him as the Red Dress Killer and began using his childhood nickname, Master Duan. For a while, it was common for police officers to greet each other by asking, "Has Master Duan been caught yet?" But despite their best efforts, it seemed like Duan had simply vanished. There was no sign of him anywhere in Yueyang, and though they didn't know it yet, that was because he'd already left the city. But Duan was no longer able to control himself. Despite his face being all over the news now, it wouldn't be long before he resumed his murderous rampage somewhere new. But before we get to that, now that we know the identity of the red dress killer, I think it's time we take a look at exactly who he was and how he ended up becoming one of China's most notorious serial killers. And you know what that means. It's time to go all the way back to the start. Before the women in red, before the late-night ambushes, before the city of Yueyang even knew his name. Duan Guocheng was born in 1975. His family's ancestral home was in Jianli County in the Hubei province. But shortly after his birth, they relocated to the city of Yueyang in Hunan, where his father had found work. On the surface, his parents seemed ordinary. They had no criminal records. Their neighbors even described them as quiet, decent people. But behind closed doors, their home life was anything but calm. His parents fought constantly. Small disagreements exploded into shouting matches, and those fights often turned physical. Over time, the atmosphere grew so toxic that the family eventually stopped sharing meals at the same table. They lived like strangers, and that environment left its mark. From a young age, Duan was quiet, withdrawn, and cold. He didn't show much emotion. He didn't make any friends. But he did start stealing. At first, it was just little things: a toy, a coin, a pocket knife. But when he was caught, his father responded with brutality. On one occasion, he used a pair of pliers to crush one of Duan's fingers as a punishment, permanently deforming it. But the punishment didn't work. It didn't scare Duan straight. If anything, it made him worse. By age 13, he'd already been given the nickname Master Duan by the other kids in his neighborhood. While this might sound like a respectful title, it was unquestionably intended to mock him, though I won't pretend to fully understand the cultural nuances behind the nickname. That same year, while still in elementary school, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to a juvenile detention center, where he'd experienced what was known at the time as reform through labor. His sentence was supposed to last 3 years, but instead of reforming behind bars, he rebelled. He broke rules, fought with guards, and showed no sign of remorse. And as a result, his sentence was extended by another 2 years. By the time Duan was released, he was 20 years old. He had spent the entirety of his teenage years behind bars, isolated, institutionalized, and angry. Within months of his release, he was arrested again for robbery. The court handed him another 5-year sentence, and by the time all was said and done, Duan had essentially been confined for half his life. Having been first imprisoned at age 13, when he finally got out, he was 25, and he was barely capable of functioning in society. His father, Duan Songqing, worked as a trash collector. He pulled every string he could to help his son, arranging for him to take a job at the Xinhai Industrial Company. It didn't pay much, just a few $100 a month, but it was something. And for a while things almost seemed stable, for the first time in his life. Duan wore neatly pressed clothes. He even shaved regularly. His father hoped he'd turned a corner. He even tried setting Duan up on a few blind dates, but the women wanted nothing to do with him. Word of his past spread quickly. And even when he fell for a girl at work, someone he liked enough to build up the courage to confess his feelings to, she rejected him. That moment shattered something inside him. From then on, he believed all women were cruel, that no woman was worth loving. And with that belief, his anger turned to hatred, and that hatred festered. He began drinking heavily, visiting prostitutes, gambling away what little money he had. He told reporters later that he never had any real friends, just people from prison who'd helped him forge documents, like the fake IDs he would later use. Duan felt cheated by life, and he blamed the world for his failures. By 1998, he felt like he had nothing, so he returned to his old ways and started stealing again. But this time, he focused his attention on women, the object of his hatred. He started mugging women at night all across Yueyang, and at first he claimed he didn't want to hurt anyone. He just wanted money. But on June 2nd, he spotted Xiao Chen as she was walking home around 11 p.m. He thought she was pretty, so he decided he was going to approach her and steal her belongings. But when he pointed his knife at her, she screamed, and this triggered something inside of him. So he dragged her into the alley and assaulted her. And when she kept screaming, he lost control of himself and stabbed her with his knife. And the more he stabbed her, the bigger the rush it gave him. He felt powerful, in control for the first time. A thrill he could never explain, and that he would come to find irresistible. After this first accidental murder, Duan maintained a relatively low profile. It's not totally clear what he did during this time period, but by April the next year, he'd quit his job at Xinhai Industrial and he was drifting aimlessly through life. He was broke, angry, and invisible to the world, and once again, he turned to robbery. But something had changed. He no longer just wanted money. He wanted that feeling again. The thrill, the control, the rage. And so, one night that spring, he waited outside the General Trade Union building in central Yueyang and watched a woman approach. Her name was Yan Sanying, and this time he wouldn't stop at robbery. He wouldn't stop at all. To keep moving and avoid detection, he began checking into cheap motels under fake names. He used a forged ID card under the name Hu Cheng, which had been made for him by an old contact from prison. In China, all guests checking into hotels are required to present government-issued identification. Without a valid ID, there was no place to stay. But with that forged card, Duan could go anywhere. Blend in, vanish, move on. He became a ghost drifting through Yueyang, changing guest houses, sticking to back alleys, sleeping through the day, and hunting by night. After slipping through the fingers of the police in Yueyang, it seemed like Duan had vanished without a trace. But in reality, he'd just changed locations. In the final days of March 2001, he boarded a long-distance bus out of the city using his fake ID. His destination was Wuhan, one of the most populous cities in central China, and a place where a man like Duan could vanish into the crowd. Initially, he stayed with a relative for a few nights in Jianli County, his family's ancestral hometown in Hubei province. With no idea what he'd done, they happily let him crash with them and even lent him 300 yuan before he left. He arrived in Wuhan just before April with nothing but the borrowed money and a single change of clothes. But that was enough. Duan had lived like a ghost for years. He knew how to survive with nothing. He settled in the Wuchang district, where the high population of migrant workers made it easy to disappear. He checked into cheap guest houses near the train station using his forged identity card, bearing the name Hu Cheng. He switched motels regularly, drifting between cheap inns, keeping to back streets, never attracting attention. He spent time familiarizing himself with the area, and then he started killing again. On the night of May 7, 2001, a 24-year-old female university student was walking home to her dormitory in Huazhong village, near building number 47, shortly after midnight. But she never made it inside, because Duan ambushed her, stabbing her repeatedly with a large fruit knife and robbing her handbag, stealing her keys, an internet access card, and other belongings. After she was dead, he molested her body. It was the first confirmed attack in Wuhan, but it wouldn't be the last. Police in Wuhan had been given a directive that all homicide cases must be solved, so they quickly labelled the case the 5-7 homicide and formed a 40-person task force led by Wuchang's police chief. They canvassed local residents, both permanent and temporary, but uncovered nothing. Duan had no local ties, and his fake ID kept him hidden. 2 nights later, on May 9th, he struck again. This time, his victim was a woman in her early 30s walking down a small alley just off Liangdao Street at around 1:30 in the morning. Duan followed her into the courtyard of her apartment building, where he grabbed her by the neck, pressed a knife to her waist, and warned her to stay quiet. She complied, handing over more than 2,000 yuan in cash before he snatched her necklace off her. After telling him it was fake, he took out a lighter to test it, a trick he'd picked up during his years as a petty thief. He then demanded sex from her. But the woman began talking, stalling, probing his behavior, trying to keep him calm. And it may have actually saved her life. Because by the time Duan had finally lost his patience and dragged her into a stairwell to kill her, 2 passerbys had appeared. As he swung down at her with his knife, she used her hand to block the blade, causing her palm to rip open. As she screamed, the passerbys rushed to help her, causing Duan to flee, leaving her shaken, but alive. Despite the growing police presence on the streets, Duan felt untouchable. Nobody here knew his face. Nobody seemed to have any idea who he was. He barely had to make an effort to hide. And there was a reason for that. While the warning bulletin from Yueyang with details of his name, appearance, aliases and crimes had been received in Wuhan, it had been completely ignored. Nobody had connected the attacks to his previous crimes. Nobody had even looked at the information. And he likely knew this, because Chinese police departments were notoriously insular, rarely coordinating or paying any attention to anything going on outside of their jurisdictions. Feeling bolder than ever, on May 25th, he attacked another woman on the exact same street. This time, he slashed her with his knife and stole 500 yuan, but he didn't kill her. His next murder occurred less than a week later, on June 1st. Just after midnight, a 41-year-old woman called Wang was walking alone near Xiang Street, heading back home from her weekly game of mahjong. Just to point out, several of the victims were said to have been walking home after playing mahjong when they were attacked. I think this is the third I've already mentioned. It might just be that the game is that popular in China, but this could also indicate some of these accounts are mixed up in the reports and using the wrong information. When she reached the metal gate to her apartment block, Duan struck her from behind with a brick. As she stumbled and screamed, he spun her around and plunged his knife into her chest 7 times. As lights came on in the other apartments, he fled the scene, leaving her to bleed out on the street. And by the time any of her neighbors arrived to try and help, she was already dead. The very next night, he encountered a young female migrant worker in Hanshangguan. She was returning home at around 3 a.m. from a night market where she washed dishes. When Duan attacked her on the stairwell to her apartment building, she fiercely resisted him. So he responded with a frenzy of violence, stabbing her more than 30 times and killing her. And then on June 3rd, he struck again, making it the 3rd night in a row that he'd murdered someone. The victim was a young woman in her 20s, staying at a government dormitory. Duan attacked her outside the building, robbing her, molesting her body, and stabbing her over 20 times. It was a killing spree unlike anything Wuhan had ever seen, and people were beginning to notice. Likely started by those who'd heard of the similar cases in Yueyang through family, friends, or migrants, a rumor began to spread that a serial killer, the red dress killer, was stalking the streets of Wuhan and killing young women at night who were wearing red. Interestingly, despite the red dress theory being widely believed in both Yueyang and Wuhan, it doesn't appear that it was ever true. According to police, most of the victims were not wearing red and had little to no similarities. They also weren't all young and didn't all have long hair, like the rumors claimed. If anything, it's perhaps more of a reflection on how little information the public was being given about the situation, causing them to fill in the gaps, allowing rumors like these to spread so easily. Families in the Wuchang district began forbidding their daughters from going out at night. Some women even stopped wearing red or cut their hair short, just in case the rumors were true. By the end of June, Wuhan's Public Security Bureau had finally acknowledged what many already knew. A serial killer was stalking the city. They formed a special task force to investigate, and it grew quickly. Within weeks, more than 1,000 officers were working the case. Vacations were cancelled, overtime was mandatory. Young female detectives were ordered to walk the streets alone at night, used as bait in hopes of drawing the killer out. One 27-year-old officer later recalled her time patrolling a narrow alley near Xiang Road. She was unarmed and made to wear a skirt, walking alone from midnight to 4 a.m., straining to hear every noise in the dark. And despite all of this, no connection to Duan and the Yueyang cases was made. Thanks to communication failures between regions, authorities in Wuhan had no idea the same man they were now hunting had already left a trail of blood in another city. There were no shared bulletins, no case comparisons, nothing. It didn't help that local journalists covering the case were muzzled. Stories were pulled, reports were spiked. The few articles that were published were circulated only among government officials, not the general public. The reasoning was to prevent panic, but in doing so, the government cut off vital information. Witnesses never came forward. Many victims didn't even realize they were in danger until it was too late. The husband of the woman murdered on June 1st later stated, "If we'd known there was a killer around, we would have been more careful. But nobody told us." On July 13th, Duan attempted to attack a woman and her child outside their house in Wuchang just after midnight. Luckily, just as he pulled out his knife, her husband appeared, causing him to run off into the darkness. She immediately contacted the police, and her description combined with the accounts of various other survivors helped authorities to piece together a composite image of Duan. In early August, 3 months after the killings had begun in Wuhan, the city's police finally had a sketch of their suspect and sent bulletins to the surrounding cities. They'd also come to believe that their killer was using the alias Hu Cheng, so they included the name in the bulletins. The second the alert came into the Yueyang Police Department, they immediately got on the phone to Wuchang. Not only did they recognize the sketch as Duan, but the crimes and murders were identical to the cases in their city, and the suspect was using the name Cheng, one of Duan's known fake identities. They told the Wuchang police that the man they were looking for was Duan Guocheng, and they'd already told them months ago that he had murdered 9 people in their city. With the police departments in Yueyang and Wuhan finally realizing they're dealing with the same killer, they now had a confirmed total of 13 murders in roughly 2 years for Duan. Members of the task force hurried over to Wuchang and helped to compile a full profile of Duan. Together, they began distributing flyers with all the information they had around the various motels and hostels across the district, given they knew he had stayed in these sorts of places throughout his murder spree in Yueyang. To their surprise, it only took 10 minutes for someone to call them. A cashier at the 719 guest house, Yu Min, rang the number on their flyer and told them that there was a guest matching their description, staying in room 311 of her establishment at that very moment. And he just so happened to be registered under the name Cheng. Already in the area distributing flyers, it took less than 5 minutes for Director Fang Yinsheng and 8 other officers to arrive at the guest house. According to some accounts, Duan was already trying to escape through the bathroom window when they stormed room 311. Others claim he was fast asleep on the bed. Either way, he didn't get far. It took 3 officers to pin him down and cuff him, but he was finally arrested and taken into custody. Under the bed, they found a blood-stained fruit knife. And in a drawer, they discovered multiple women's purses and other stolen items that would later be confirmed to belong to victims of the red dress killer. They even found shoes that perfectly matched footprints they had lifted from the 4 Wuchang murder scenes. When they sat Duan down, they expected him to deny everything. But to their surprise, he confessed immediately. Over the next several hours, he laid out his crimes in chilling detail for the detectives, admitting to dozens of robberies and assaults, including all 13 of the murders. He even told them about his first ever murder back in 1998. When asked why he stabbed his victims so many times, his answer was simple. He told them that when women screamed, it made him feel a rush, an unexplainable, uncontrollable urge that he had come to desperately crave. After conducting psychiatric evaluations, reports claim no signs of mental illness were discovered, with the psychiatrists all declaring that he was fully mentally sane and fully aware of what he was doing. He was transferred to the Wuhan No. 2 detention center, where he was formally charged. Few details exist about his trial, but it appears that it began around December 2001 and ended in February 2002, with him being sentenced to death. His mother attempted to visit him before his execution, delivering clothes to him in prison. But she wasn't allowed to see him. The only contact she received was a slip of paper signed by Duan to say he'd gotten the clothes. Though the exact date of his execution is unknown, justice moves quickly in China. So he was likely killed by a firing squad in the days or weeks after his trial ended. With the arrest and execution of Duan, the news blackout was finally lifted, and Wuhan's front pages declared that the psycho killer had been caught. Provincial leaders praised the officers involved in the case, with the detectives from the Wuchang branch receiving commendations and a 100,000 yuan bonus. Yu Min was also given a 200,000 reward for placing the tip that led to Duan's arrest. The red dress killer was finally off the streets, but for the families of the women who were killed, and for those who narrowly escaped with their lives, no celebration could bring back what had been lost. For the survivors, the scars ran deeper than anyone could see. For the families, there were no answers that could ever make sense of it. And for the rest of the country, those who'd followed the case in silence, or only learned about it once it was over, the name Duan Guocheng would linger as a reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. It didn't take long for his name to disappear from the headlines. But the fear he left behind, that took much longer to fade. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the red dress killer comes to a close. As always, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all those sorts of things that help the algorithm gods decide whether it's worthy or not. As I said up front, most of the information used to write this script has come from Chinese sources, so there are definitely some gaps in my timeline, and more than likely some mistakes in some of the details, but I've tried my best to be as accurate as possible with the information I was able to find. If you enjoy my channel and want to support my work further, there's a membership option here on YouTube, and a Patreon linked down below as well. But just know, the act of watching my videos is more than enough support, and I'm so grateful for every single one of you who tunes in to watch my stuff. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.